Mi je veliko veselje, namreč imeli smo v planu Rubena povabiti že par let nazaj, pa nas je deloma tudi COVID v tem preprečil. Ruben Pater je nizozemski oblikovalec, ki se velikokrat sprašuje, kakšna je vez med kapitalizmom in oblikovanjem, potem kako je kapitalizem popolnoma prevzel grafično oblikovanje in kako se ga lahko osvobodimo. Je oblikovanje nepovratno ujeto v sistemu izkoriščanja v imenu dobička, v ciklu, ki poglablja neenakost in povečuje obseg izčrpavanja naravnih virov. Pod nazivom Untold Stories Ruben že vrsto let ustvarja vizualne pripovedi, ki podpirajo solidarnost, pravičnost in enakost. Njegov cilj pa je odpreti in oblikovati nove poglede na kompleksne družbene in politične probleme z ustvarjanjem vizualnih zgodb, ki s pomočjo podob, tiskanih interaktivnih medijev ter filma dosegajo širše občinstvo. Leta 2013 je s projektom Drone Survival Guide pritegnil svetovno pozornost za razpravo o vojaških brezpilotnikih. V knjigi The Politics of Design iz leta 2016 je raziskoval politično odgovornost oblikovalcev. Njegova zadnja knjiga, Caps Lock, ki bo na voljo tudi za nakup tukaj v Cukrarni oziroma v času sejma Cafe and Hours, ki se začne prav tako jutri od 5 naprej. Njegova zadnja knjiga Caps Lock je postala mednarodna uspešnica celo zunaj področja oblikovanja vizualnih komunikacij in je delo, ki z jasnimi vizualnimi primeri prikazuje, kako sta grafično oblikovanje in kapitalizem postala neločljivo povezane. In kar je še posebej zanimivo, v zadnjem delu knjige ponuja nekaj alternativ. So I just did a short introduction. Most of the talks today was in Slovenian, but now we will switch in English. So please give a warm applause to our guest, Ruben Pater.
Avala. Yeah, we got it. Thank you so much for inviting me and for coming also today. So yeah, I'm a graphic designer, and also besides that, I also teach in the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague. I work out of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and I also I've written 2 books, one in 2016 called The Politics of Design, and one last year, which I'm going to talk about today. So how does a graphic designer end up writing a book about capitalism? So maybe the first thing is for 10 years I worked at commercial studios, like maybe some of you have done or are going to do, working for cultural clients, but also advertising, but also branding, so a very wide variety of design. And then if you work in the business for a while, you learn all these things, right? Like you know how it works. Like what designers put on their websites and how to talk about design is something completely different than how it actually works on the floor. Like when your boss asks you to work the whole weekend, you know, without getting paid, or when you have to work the whole night on a project you don't like, or where clients come to you with things you're like, yeah, should I be really working on this gentrification project for real estate? So it becomes very clear how like the economy under the design world works. So that really like kind of informed my idea about how it kind of really works in the design world. And the other aspect was that after my first book, I was really looking for a more ethical way to run my practice. Graphic designers create a lot of demand for products we don't need. They create a lot of waste, whether it's digital waste or physical waste. So we are playing a part in this climate crisis, and I wanted to figure out how, or even if it would be possible to be a designer in a kind of ethical way in relationship to climate change, right? Because we have a lot of crises right now. We have inequality. 2,000 billionaires have more wealth than 60% of the world combined. We have 688 million people going hungry every day, which is probably going to be a lot more this winter with the current energy situation in Europe. But yeah, most of all, what we've seen is since 1988, when governments started to get together to discuss climate change and to make all these plans and all these climate summits, very little has changed. CO2 emissions have actually risen by 40% since then, and they're still continuing to rise. So we speak a lot about sustainability, but in the end we see very little of it back in the measurements, right? So it's not just that like we are like, you know, we want to be critical, but it's also, I think, a matter of like we have to, you know, we cannot continue that the way that designers have been continuing to work. And it's also not that everybody is complicit in this, because you know, the 1%, the richest 1% emits twice as much CO2 as the rest of the poorest half of the world population. And of course, Europe is a big part of this, where the average European emits 70 times as much as the average Ethiopian. So when we talk about things like degrowth or consuming less, we mostly talk about the wealthiest people, you know, let's be honest. And I think it's also important to understand that something like degrowth, so Matthias Schmelzer wrote an interesting book about this at Verso, is going to happen anyway, you know, whether it's by disaster, and this is not what we want. We don't want the disasters as already been kind of unfolding more and more. No, we want to already start planning this situation. So back to my book. So for me, it was really important in order to figure out a more ethical practice. Why do we create demand? Why do we need to grow? And why do we work like this as designers? So I wanted to understand the relationships historically between the economic system, which ultimately drives this growth. So I want to start, and this is the first chapter of my book, with the idea of statecraft and the kind of first role of the designers. And this brings me to the first documents, the graphic documents that have ever been found. So this is 5,000 years ago from Mesopotamia, currently like around Iraq. So cities like Uruk in Mesopotamia could be up to 200,000 people. So having an economic transaction in such a city, you need a kind of evidence, right? You cannot just trust somebody like, I'm gonna lend you money because I know you and I know where you live. Like if you have, you know, big societies, you need to have trust in strangers as well. So the clay tablets that were made by one of the few people that actually had schools for this, they made these documents. Like this is an accounting document. This is a receipt for beer. But this was before there was writing. So before there was writing, so this is not a love poem or like this is not prose, this is accounting, there was already accounting. So the fact that accounting actually predates writing is an interesting way of understanding the relationship, the importance of forging economic trust into documents that cannot be forged, and being able to write and making these documents in that time was, of course, like a secure technology, because very few would be able to do that, right? But if we move like thousands of years later, so this is the first banknote from Europe, this is from Sweden, we actually see that it's kind of the same. So we see this document that uses the printing press, that uses this boundary of ornament, that uses also autographs and stamps to of course, make it difficult to counterfeit, but also to prove that this is an actual banknote and that you could actually go to the bank and pick up the coins, which was what it was used for, the first banknotes. So you realize that the designer here is the person who instills the trust into the document, why we have confidence in the economy. You know, if your landlord gives you a contract handwritten, almost illegible, you will not kind of believe it. Or if it's in Comic Sans, you know, like you'll be like, make it at least look like a normal contract. So things like contracts and map and money has to look a certain way, not just to make it difficult to counterfeit, but also because we have to trust it, right? This is a fiction that we're creating. Now with colonial times, so this is the first multinational in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and the first stock exchange was based on colonial pillaging done by the Dutch. And what you see here is that already the first financial newspapers on the left from 1636 looks very similar to a financial newspaper today. You see a list of numbers, you see resources, the prices. It was very important at that time for the investors to understand if ships were going to come back or not, because these voyages were very risky and the investors wanted to know if it paid off, right? So these documents as a proof also of investment and return on investment is very important. And we just saw also an interesting project using infographics. The first infographics, especially the ones by William Playfair, who is considered like one of the inventors of things like the bar chart and the pie chart. He was an economist. He was from Scotland. He was an economist and an engineer, and most of the work that he did was about the economy of Scotland. So that also infographics, using them in a way for economy, came really from this kind of time. So it was not devised by artists, you know, it was not devised for artistic means, it was devised for mathematical economic means. And of course we need that, and we saw that with the COVID project, that we need to be able to understand statistical data and to process that, right? But statistics is also the language of, the scientific language of the state. This is literally what statistics means. So when you talk about things like cadastral maps and certificates, you also show a kind of vision on property. Property has to be owned. Property is not collective, you know? Property is either owned by you or by somebody else, and you can do, once you own the land, you can do with it what you want, right? So when we look through the world through this language of numbers and mathematics and infographics, this makes it easier to trade with one another. That makes a global trade possible, but you also lose the social background of these economical transactions, because behind every one of those numbers, there's like a family, right? There's somebody working. There's like a square mile of rainforest being cut down. Like, because you don't see that, it becomes easier to make these trades and to make violent decisions. And we saw that, for example, during the 2008 financial crisis, when in the US there were entire streets that were completely empty because people were evicted because they couldn't pay their mortgage. They were sleeping on the street, but the houses were immediately bought up by investors, kept empty just to wait their prices to rise. So the right for the investor for their property to regain value is considered more important by law than having somebody give them a roof over their head, right? Which is usually kind of guaranteed by the state, but not legally in the sense that you can judge it in court. So that's very interesting, because in a small community you would never do that, but in a community, in a large community in the capitalist world, that makes complete sense, you know? And the fact that we can also look at this differently, I think this is an interesting project. This is from Gapminder. This is a Swedish NGO, that is a statistical NGO. And they made this website about incomes in the world. It's called Dollar Street. And then you see the incomes of different families in the world, but you don't just see their income, you see their dog, you see your family pictures, you see them cooking, you see their car, and then you realize, yeah, we cannot just compare numbers like that. You know, like being happy and or having a good life and what kind of income you have is not necessarily equally related. And it also becomes more difficult to take violent decisions about somebody who's not paying their mortgage and all these things when you understand the social context behind it. So I think understanding that we also need to understand that economy is in its base a social science, right? And that also needs social information to be communicated. Otherwise, we just become mathematicians. That's what have many technocratic European economists have become, right? They're just like accountants, basically. So for me, this is really interesting in the terms of design, like how designers are also part of this kind of communicative strategy of understanding economics and its social context. And I also wanted to share some of my own work, how I try to, and how I've learned to kind of understand the social context. So in 2014, I was asked by an artist to help him in doing research after the people who live in campings. So in the Netherlands, we have these campings or campsites that are, we have the most campings per capita, and people don't necessarily sleep in tents, but in these kind of like mobile homes. And that was the way that most people in the 1960s and 70s would go on holiday, right? You would take your family there. That would be in the Netherlands. It would be very cheap. But yeah, since the 1990s, because of cheap airfares and kerosene subsidies, it's now cheaper to go to Spain or Italy, and Holland is not a very warm country, so people love going abroad, right? So now these campuses are kind of like emptying out, and what you see is that because of the scarcity of housing in the Netherlands, we have a very small country and a high population in comparison. We realized that it's almost impossible to get a social house. Waiting for a social house in Amsterdam is about 15 to 20 years. So if you need a house because you come from a divorce, that's not the kind of time that you have at that moment. But also we have many migrant laborers from, for example, Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, that often stay there seasonally and they need a house to stay in, and the Dutch government cannot provide housing for these groups. So a lot of people like that, but also people in debt, they have no other place to go to these campings. And in the media, they're often portrayed as like, you know, people who are very poor, or maybe people who want to stay outside of the law, maybe they do criminal behavior. So all of these kind of stigmas that are created by the media. And then you realize as a designer, so I was involved in this research, and for 3 months we went to these campings and we talked to people who live there, we talked to the owners. So he was really doing this kind of sociological field work. He was also a former social worker. We realized that people in those situations, even if they have to raise a family of 4 on an income of 300 euros a month, and this is one of the persons that we met there, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a victim. That doesn't necessarily mean they want to feel like victimized or poor, or that they want to be helped. People want to be empowered, right? So this kind of traditional socialist imagery where you show a photograph of a poor person, and the person who views, their role is basically to feel empathy through the photograph with that person and then help the person. So you create this power relation. And then by doing this field work, I realized we didn't want to like perpetuate these stereotypes. So but we needed to communicate something. So then I kind of realized, let's use emojis. I mean, everybody's like on WhatsApp and using these things. You can use them in conversations. But emojis for campsites that are kind of run down, or for migrant workers, or for people who are in debt, they don't exist. There's a lot of emojis for products. There's interesting articles about the neoliberal logic behind emojis and who picks them. So I decided to create a set of emojis that are about poverty, that are about homelessness, but in a like positive, funny, and cheeky way. For example, this police officer that's kind of allowing people to live on campsites, which is actually illegal. So he's like condoning it, like kind of looking through his fingers. And the other aspect of this was really interesting. The research, by talking to all these people, we realized it was not their social situation that was putting them in this position. It was basically the ferocity of the Dutch bureaucracy. Because the Dutch bureaucracy is like so neatly organized, right? Like very, very strictly organized, that if you don't adhere to the specific rules, you basically are like an outcast in society. You have no other place to go than to a camping. So I started to map this kind of bureaucracy. So I started to think about, okay, so you don't have access to social housing, and then this happens, and you come from a divorce, and then this happens. So I began mapping for many weeks this complexity of the Dutch bureaucracy. And in the end, actually the only design decision, besides of the emojis for representation, was making this maze. We call it a maze because it's called Camping Kafka, obviously. How do you end up on these campsites? How do people end up in this situation where they could get kicked out of these campings because they live there illegally? You can get a fine of 20,000 euros. So in using the emojis, and the thing was like a way to attract people to an infographic that still uses this, this rational language, but then trying to kind of like seduce people into this language. And the emojis were also kind of used to create a kind of space. So you see that here, because in the end, we didn't want to create like a logo, or we didn't want to create like a letterhead or a T-shirt. No, we realized people just needed a space to discuss with one another, because social workers, people living in campsites, and people from the Dutch government were never talking with each other. They were not talking with Polish migrant workers, because the Polish migrant workers didn't speak Dutch, just Polish. So the only thing we did is we created this pavilion, you see it here, where we invited for four different events, different people from different stakeholders to discuss with one another in a kind of neutral ground. What were the possibilities of kind of addressing, and what kind of ways were there to kind of change the loopholes of Dutch bureaucracy, and also informing people working at the state why they should be more flexible of allowing this kind of informality in a culture where housing is so scarce, right? And it's a camping, so it should also be fun. So there was like a water slide, you see it here, or a slide. So this project taught me a lot about the importance of fieldwork and kind of social consciousness in design projects, and that Googling things or taking knowledge from statistics is only one side of the story, but especially when social conditions are very strongly associated with these things, it's very important to understand that not every statistic is similar, right? So the second chapter I want to discuss is more about this idea of branding, which comes maybe a bit closer to what some of you are working on if you're designers. And also a little bit about this core of the relationship between capitalism and design. And part of that is markets, right? So this is a Dutch painting about a kind of market scene in 1550. And of course, prior to capitalism, a lot of people, the majority, for example, the population in Europe, they would have access to a piece of land where they could grow their own food and things so self-produce a lot of the things that they needed for sustenance, and whatever they could not make, you buy on the market, right? So the market just has like this function where you buy things that you could otherwise not produce yourself. My grandma had a farm, and they would also make their own clothes, for example. The clothes that my mom wore were made by my grandma, right? But of course, slowly capitalism pushed people from their lands, the common lands, which is famously, of course, kind of the origin of agricultural capitalism. And people had basically no land anymore to grow their own food. So the only thing they could do is get a job in the city, in the factory, and then buy it at a supermarket or at a market. And today, like, the supermarket is like the image of the victory of capitalism, right? The abundance of choice, like also how easy it is to buy different products, and how all these products are brought together in the same place. and also this is the pinnacle of branding. This is the pinnacle of like package design, what you see here. Like it's all like graphic, what you see here, right? You don't see almost never the actual product. You see the packaging format. But behind kind of this facade of abundance, there's of course also the inner workings of capitalism, where supermarkets only sell 2% on average of local products. In the Netherlands, we have a lot of apples, like many countries in Europe. We grow our own apples, but you can buy apples from New Zealand, and why is that, right? They would be actually put like at the eye level, while the Dutch apples are like below. So if you would not pay attention, you would like buy the apples from New Zealand. Why? You know, there's a whole complex relationship about the people who sell them. And then when you realize the kind of companies that make the things in our supermarkets, they're like a handful of companies who have so much power and so much influence over the food industry, over the supermarkets, but also how farmers produce. And then you realize, for example, I worked myself in a plastic factory while I was in art school. And they would be filled with the same detergent. It was like a detergent to clean things. But there would be different labels slapped on it. So you have like the same detergent, but like different brands. So the branding, the only thing it does is to distinguish in price, right? Like we can ask a bit more for this one with the label, and this one is like the normal label, and we ask a little bit less money. So a lot of this branding is just a kind of like, you know, a kind of magic to make things much more expensive than they actually need to be, or create demand and imply that this product is radically different than something else you already have, right? And with this kind of like mega brands of the 1990s, Apple and Nike, this creates like a completely new level, where the CEO of Nike, Phil Knight, basically said, we realized we're not a, you know, we don't produce, we create images, we create marketing. So they send all their production to low-wage countries. They buy them from subcontractors. So people like, companies like Apple and Nike don't actually literally produce shoes. They don't produce anything anymore. They produce intellectual property. They produce ideas, they produce advertising, and then they buy their, you know, their products from like subcontractors in other countries. And then you realize that with companies like Facebook, they can become, they don't actually make any like physical products anymore, but they can become extremely valuable. So it's completely this kind of branding that is like elevating these companies to like billion-dollar levels, right? And then you realize this kind of power of branding and created these images and this fiction that was once just created to like distinguish things that came from the factory line, right? And it's, I think, also important to realize the colonial history of this. Branding, of course, comes from the Norwegian word brander, which comes from burning like a mark into an animal, right, into cattle. But this also happened under Roman times with slaves. And this reached an industrial scale during colonialism, where Dutch West and Dutch East India companies basically had complete manuals on how to brand slaves, enslaved peoples, what kind of like marks to use, and it was kind of a whole design program. And this act of basically using torture to turn a human into a commodity, right? You turn a human into a good that can be bought and sold, that has no rights by itself. The owner can just do with that good whatever they want, is kind of central to this idea of capitalism, shown here really nicely in this work by Henk Willis Thomas, where branding can really turn something like water, for example, that should be a basic human right, into something really expensive, and really take the kind of innate cultural value and natural value of something away from it and commodify that. I found this really funny. I tried to find the most expensive bottles of water, and then so the right one is, I think, 219 euros for 700 milliliters. And this is like, only designer can do that, right? Like if I put this water in a plastic bottle and I tell you this water costs 200 euros, you're like, nah. But if I make the bottle with the sparkles and the logo and everything, you're like, okay, I could see that, right? So we are so like used how branding kind of like subverts our idea of value and can completely like turn something like accessible to everyone into like an expensive good. Another example from my own town is city branding. What I found really funny is all these brands are in English, right? I mean, in Germany and in France and in the Netherlands, English is not the first language. That's because these logos are not meant for the people who actually live in these cities. City brands are meant for rich tourists, to invite rich tourists to come to the cities. It's a way of selling the city, right? A city doesn't need an identity. A city has plenty of culture, but in order to commodify a city, you need to give it a logo, which then can be sold. So Amsterdam was, for example, not a way to bring pride to the people of Amsterdam. We have pride of our city. No, it was to attract foreign investors and sell actively real estate to foreign investors. And this was done by the city of Amsterdam, inviting people from all over the world to invest in Dutch real estate and attract like wealthy tourists. Creating kind of this kind of branding situations. This was in 2014, so 8 years later we have a doubling in homelessness because people are selling their stuff on Airbnb and the city has become completely unaffordable. Some people owning like 600 houses, subletting those for high prices. Because real estate, especially in the Netherlands, but in many places, is not something that can be a market because it's a scarce resource, right? And I think this really points to the kind of essence of capitalism, where these things make completely no sense in a small community, but they make complete sense in capitalism. Oh, of course, people are sleeping on the street in the richest country of the world, and we have like 10% of the housing that is empty because it's just waiting for the investment to rise. That is completely normal, right? If you think about it, it's insane. And then I have a lot of friends that go squatting, and then the municipality of Amsterdam sends the riot police to kick them out because they prefer the building to be empty, owned by a big real estate company from the US. And they realize also how this is kind of ingrained in the law, like what kind of like rights to property and to housing are actually basically realistic. So in 2018, there was municipal elections in Amsterdam, and I worked together with some designers to make this campaign. Who owns the city, or van wie is de stad in Dutch? The colors of the Amsterdam are red and black. This is why all the colors are in those, the posters are in those colors. We created a bunch of posters, but we had no money to print them. So we put them for free as PDFs on the website before the elections, complaining about the selling out of the city. The municipality was also actively selling kind of their own property in order to make a profit. Yeah, some of them, they might be also clear in the relationship to, I think, what you also experience everywhere else, also in Ljubljana in terms of gentrification. The left one says, I don't like monoculture. But what happened then, and this is also funny about like sharing your designs with other people, people started downloading them and printing them in large numbers, and suddenly we found them all over the street. We didn't know who did it. That's also really nice, right? That sometimes you just give something to a community and people take that further. And I think that was a really nice way to bring creatives together and to work on something that is not only meant for that can still be shared and still can be celebrated, the kind of love for the city also, but that doesn't necessarily have to, be like commodifying something. So that was a nice experience. And I also wanted to talk about another of my chapters in my book. The book took me 4 years to write. It has like 500 pages. I'm not going to talk about everything, don't worry. But I also write a chapter called The Designer as Hacker, about the role of information technology and design. I think this is interesting. Because first of all, I mean, it's also not true that moving everything online is necessarily sustainable, because we know that the internet uses 3 to 6% of global energy, and also one transaction of Bitcoin, if you talk about cryptocurrency, uses the same amount of energy as an entire household in the US for 1 year. So this is famously a very energy draining technology. But what I found really interesting and helpful about research in the kind of hacker culture is, so here you see Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak working on the first Apple computer, is that the first computers, even by Apple, who is now known for completely copywriting and patenting everything, was actually open source. Because they were in a computer club in California, and they used a lot of the knowledge of the people in their club to build the Apple I and the Apple II. So they were like, yeah, we have to give back to the community. So basically, they sold the computer, but you could get the blueprints for free, which is amazing, right? And this is very far away from what they would do now, even though that the operating system of my Apple computer right here is still based on open source software. The money that's still made on this platform is still based on the work of people who have done that for free and have done that collectively. And I think this is important because as designers, a lot of the platforms we publish our work on, but also the type of software we use, is still largely in the hands of a handful of companies, right? So those companies decide the aesthetics, what we make, where it's published, in what kind of form. So visual communication in our culture is also very much dictated by these kind of technological companies. And also, make no mistake, the way that surplus value is created, so the way that that our time is kind of like monetized, is also increasingly done invisibly with algorithms. So this is a patent by Apple Computer. So maybe some of you have an iPhone. So the iPhone has a built-in face recognition software. So when you are, for example, looking at Instagram, you see an ad, there's a camera on the phone that can read your face and it can do semantic analysis, right? That means it can see if you're happy, if you're sad, if you're excited, if you're bored. And this patent, and this is already from, let me see, 2013, already allows Apple to monetize, to monetize your expression. Oh, Ruben must like this advertisement. Let's remember that, And he liked it, so you have to pay more for that. So even without us knowing now, our behavior can be monetized through this kind of programs, right? There's amazing, some of these examples. I have one chapter of them. One of the patents is by Facebook. If you put a picture on Facebook, and you're at a party, let's say, and you have a bottle in your hand with a beverage, and the label is visible, Facebook will recognize that label, and they will make contact with the person who is selling that. Let's say it's a brand of beer. And then it will use that image. It's allowed to use that image for advertising that beer, basically. If it will find that automatically in your Facebook pictures. So I think this is like tremendously interesting, and this idea of surveillance capitalism that Zuzana Sobov writes about, I think is very legitimate in that sense, because a lot of the design work we do right now is also, of course, not physical anymore, but a lot of times ephemeral and digital. And this also brings me back to one of my first projects that was mentioned. This is the Drone Survival Guide from 2012. So this is the first project I did after I finished my master, and I was kind of to reorient my practice. I wanted to do something between design and journalism that was basically took the public as a client and not waited for companies. At that time, drone warfare was something in the news, especially in Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. But a lot of people didn't really understand what drones were and what could they do. People were talking about like they have lasers and stuff. So I decided to take the most prominent drones, both military and civilian, and to map them out by scale with the silhouettes, like this bird. Maybe you know these bird posters or books with birds where you can recognize them with the silhouettes, right? This idea of like 21st century bird watching. So you can look at the sky in 2050 and you can see, this is a Russian drone or this is like a Chinese drone. Should I be worried or not? And it would also say if it can be weaponized or not. And then on the back, it had these kind of tactics to evade drones and to kind of explain the sensors on the drones. And as you see, this work is in Pashtun and English, because Pashtun is the language spoken in the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And it was important for me because a lot of the times these kind of critical projects are done in English and they are in a gallery somewhere in, I don't know, Europe or the UK or the US. But drone warfare is by definition, something that happens on two places, right? It's where the pilots are, and the other side is where the drones are, where people are kind of like the victim of the violence of the drones. So I always, this project always needs to be done in two languages. So I printed a bunch of these posters. I put it online for free, so you can go to dronesurvivalguide.org and you can download it. And I said, okay, if you make a free translation, you also get like a free poster, because I wanted people to do translations in all different languages. And you could buy this poster for like 10 euros, because I had to make the money back that I put into it. But yeah, people could also download it. So this idea of open source, sharing knowledge was also part of this work. And then, some American blog picked it up, and then lots of people started emailing me, and it got kind of like some attention. And now I have like 40 translations. So I ended up producing one in Hebrew and Arabic, for example, for Palestine, Israel. There's one about Eastern Europe. There's also one about Latin America, but also the types of drones are different in that context. So that's for me an interesting example how to make graphic design work that still can get you some value, right? Like it did make me some money for the time I put in, but it's also accessible for free for people who cannot afford, or people who have no access to it for some other reason. So I think this open source aspect, I will get back to it a bit later, so I think quite interesting. But I think what my book also, what I found out is, until now I've spoken about that the objects that designers make, whether they're banknotes, whether they're advertisements, are basically creating demand for capitalism or creating trust in the economic system. But what's just as important is how designers themselves also work. You know, if they're bosses, if they're interns, if they get paid well, if they have to work all night or all weekend. So this like history of work and what work is in our society, I think is quite interesting. So going a little bit back to the idea of before capitalism, where most people at least had the, kind of the access to a kind of piece of land to produce. Is kind of important because when you're also your own producer, you can have your own kind of sustenance and even make sure that you can at least eat a little bit. But if you just have a factory job, basically that's a different story. But if you talk about graphic design in the same time, when it was not called graphic design, you would talk about things like bookmaking that were, for example, done in the workshop context, right? So there would be a workshop, often made from the family, often also patriarchal in origin, but writing text, typesetting, even cutting type, printing, doing illustrations. So production and design was all done under the same roof. So it was very clear the relationship between the production and design, right? And the movement to the factory is, of course, this moment where the factory floor became dirty, became noisy, became dangerous, and also where design became its own discipline around the 1900s, where it was literally also coined, and design were like white-collar workers that would work on a different floor of the factory, right? Even though, of course, production is still done in this kind of dirty way, now it's like out of sight, right? A lot of the production, for example, fashion, while designed maybe in Europe, is done in low-wage countries where many designers don't even know who's making their clothing or where it's made. So this relationship with production is kind of lost. And so the design office of today is like this intellectual property, right? We're creating intellectual property all day. That also means we are not bound anymore by production limits, you know, by the production cycles. So that means we can speed up basically as quickly as the computer will comply with our demands. Also because a lot of design is now digital. So combined with that, there's also this, of course, this idea that designers, often people say, oh, you must be so happy to be a designer, you do what you love. You know, designers do a creative profession, so they should be very thankful for, the kind of work that they do. So then you have graphic designers that produce things like this. You know, you have to be really proud of working hard, you have to work weekends, you have to do unpaid work, this is all super good for you. And only if you do that, you will get famous and it will be amazing. This is, for example, a book they give to Facebook employees. It says, "The quick shall inherit the earth." So this Silicon Valley is also really like that. You know, they say, ship early, produce early, then we can start on the next iteration of the software. So this kind of speeding up of digitalization makes it really possible for us to never stop working, right? So maybe our like the hours we work have diminished, but actually we spend a lot of more time on work because my design students in The Hague, they have to update their LinkedIn, they have to do their Instagram, they have to learn coding, they have to do entrepreneurship lessons, and then they have burnouts, and then they have depression, and there's really a rising amount of this kind of mental health complaints among designers, and not just among designers, because also with technologies like WhatsApp, we're supposed to be like kind of on call for work all the time, right? And this idea that as long as we work hard enough, we will make it, we will be famous, is of course, one of the big fictions of capitalism. I love this graphic by the New York Times. So these are that all of the women CEOs in the Fortune 500, these are the Fortune 500 most valuable companies in the US. There's as many women as men named John. You know, so of course, white men named John are not like genetically better in, leading companies. Of course, a lot of this, and we know this has to do with where you were born, the color of your skin, the school you went to, who your parents know, how much money your parents have. No, this is not a level playing field, obviously not. So this is kind of the lie that has been told to kind of keep us working harder and harder because we might be famous and we might be to this lucky, few percent. And there's also a really important feminist argument here is the one of unproductive reproductive labor, right? Because there's a lot of things in society that are very valuable, like, let's say, raising children, cooking your food, cleaning your house, political organizing, community organizing, taking care of sick and elderly. That is not considered work at all. You have to do it for free. You have to do it just because you have to. And this is work that was historically, but still today, often done by women, right? So what if you spend your whole life taking care of children and cooking? You cannot put anything on your resume. You don't get any financial compensation for that. While, in fact, if we would stop doing that today, society would collapse, right? And we saw that during COVID, where the most critical professions like nurses, like school teachers, firemen, get paid the least. So what we consider valuable in our economy, what people get paid, and what is actually valuable for society is something completely different. So what we consider work and what we consider valuable is also something that really needs addressing. Because all this hard work that I was talking about, and this is the famous graph from the Economic Policy Institute from the US, is that productivity, so how much we produce per hour and how much we get paid per hour, actually went up until 1973, right? And then suddenly you see, unions had little power because a lot of factories were transferred overseas. So power of unions also politically was broken through neoliberal policies of people like Reagan and Thatcher. So what you see is actually productivity is still rising. We're still working harder and harder, being more productive, but we're not getting paid more. And I think for many people, young people today, it will be very obvious that my parents used to be able to afford living in a house on one working class income. Yeah, you cannot do that anymore today, right? So where does all this extra work going through? Well, then you see this here. This is the relationship between CEO to worker pay. And you see 20 to 1 in 1965, and today this is 320 to 1. So this money is going somewhere. It's creating this enormous inequality that we've been facing. So, I think it's good to like your work. I mean, I'm also working right now, but it's also good not to see work as a goal in itself, and to also understand that not working and taking care of others and also living is also very important in that, and that kind of forcing each other to overwork and to work like incessantly is not really healthy for society and not really healthy for us. We spend more time with our colleagues than with our family, so why not spend it in a more enjoyable manner, right? So my book doesn't really have like answers for all of this, because I'm also from the Netherlands and I know the Dutch context of design. I worked in some other countries, but I know the context of graphic design is very different in Slovenia, it's very different in Latin American countries and African countries. So I don't think like a one-fits-all scenario is what we need. That was the problem in the first place. But there are some interesting kind of logics that we can learn from historically, like the power of unions. There are some design unions being started now. This is the Designers and Cultures Union from the UK. Unionizing, I mean, unions have their issues, but it's still a really important thing if you want to stop, for example, working for having unpaid internships, not working for fossil fuel companies. It works really a lot better to, get together and organize and to have like a collective voice instead of just trying to do it by yourself and just competing with one another, which was kind of what designers are doing right now. If we're just competing with one another, sooner or later our work is also going to be outsourced to algorithms, which is already happening to a lot of design work as we speak. Myself, I try to do that in small ways. I'm part of this solidarity network called Vloerwerk. They're an anarchist solidarity network in Amsterdam that started when there was a freelance programmer and he didn't get his invoice paid from the client. It was like 1,500 euros, not a lot, but yeah, if you're a freelancer, you don't get paid, what can you do? I had many of those instances. And he was like, what if I get a bunch of my friends and we start standing in front of their office making noise with big signs, clients are scared, immediately the bill was paid, right? And now they're a network of hundreds of people and they are really effective. They try to find a company where it hurts, they get people rehired again, they get sick pay again. So this is a really like direct action group, which I really like. This is some of the t-shirts I made for them. I also like making, because I'm still a designer, like making things also for activist organizations. These are scarves for the anarchist union in the Netherlands. It's the idea you are at a demo and you don't have a sign, so you can use your scarf, right? So this one. And what's also nice is they create a kind of like sense of identity. Anarchists are all often scared of like voicing their political ideology because you're kind of frowned upon. But now it becomes like this thing that people are proud of. I found some kids like adorning these scarves in the city. That's a really nice and really valuable way of contributing as a designer. I made this sticker for Radical Riders. That's a union of delivery riders. Delivery riders are getting a little bit, because of the pressure of the unions like this, are really getting a little bit of a better situation now in the Netherlands. But yeah, being freelancers, breaking their legs when they're biking because they hurry so much, not getting paid the sick pay, when they break things, having really bad bikes, all these things. So it's really important that the European Union is cracking down on this kind of like what I would call like extremely precarious labor, right? The conditions that we're now in. And in my book, what I kind of do is I end like not with one answer. I do talk about the commons a little bit, this idea to to understand value in a different way. I'm not going to talk about it too much now, but I found a lot of collectives in the world, design collectives that have been trying like to resist capitalist logics for 10 years or more. And that was for me really inspiring, and that made me also decide to really finish the book and put it out and really feel that there are actually alternatives and there are things you can do besides your political, let's call it, duty. For example, this is Cooperativa de Diseño from Argentina. They're a feminist collective of 7 women. They work a lot for feminist organizations and also for pro-abortion protests, but they also are product designers and they work for this collectivist factory in Argentina. And because they're cooperative, right, they don't have bosses, right, so they can make their own, let's say, all of their decisions together as a cooperative, and also they can get paid equally for the time they put in. So this is nice about a cooperative, right? At the same time, this also allows them to do things like maternity leave, things that are really important, and like about reproductive labor and this kind of feminist aspect of like critique of work, that they can kind of put that into their kind of collective as well. So I was also talking about open source. This is OSP, Open Source Publishing from Brussels. They're amazing. For 15 years, they've been making graphic design only with open source software. They don't use Mac OS X, you don't use Adobe. All of their work is put online for free for forking, so they really come from this kind of software analogy. But they do say you have to credit. It's important to retrace the kind of creation process. What I really like is they really consider culture to be a collective thing, you know? Like I didn't invent books. I also stand on the shoulders of people who went before me. So kind of using copyright as a way to put a wall around, you know, like your work is not only really strange, but also kind of problematic. So copyrights often don't serve individual designers. They serve multinationals like H&M who steal from young designers and have armies of lawyers to get away with it. So I think it's really important to really understand that copyrights are often more than not helping us. And a more collective idea of culture is more about sharing and creating together, but also finding out different ways of value. How do we create value from this work? Because work should not be free, you should be reimbursed, but how do we do that in a way that not one person becomes a millionaire and another person cannot make ends meet while they might work the same hours, right? So lastly, Brave New Alps from Bolzano. Not so far in Tyrol. They're a collective of graphic designers. They did their PhD in London about the relationship between capitalism and graphic design as well. And then they realized we cannot stay in London if we work like this because, yeah, you know, this is too expensive. So they moved back to where their parents were living in Bolzano, and they were starting to create relationship with their neighborhood right there, working for small businesses, asking for European subsidies of this kind of rural development, but also really focusing on local development. And for many designers, that's not really like fancy. You're supposed to work for companies in the United States and in Japan, and for Nike and for Apple, and move around and live in Berlin and move to New York. But that's not a very climate-friendly way of living, but also it doesn't really establish strong relationships, right? You're just doing it for your portfolio or for becoming rich or famous. And so their work doesn't really win awards. It has the aesthetics that everybody kind of loves, but it's socially increasingly important because they are really seen as a community center, and they're also going to stay in this neighborhood. And that's the same for this one, the Public in Canada. They're a community of queer and BIPOC designers who went to this neighborhood in Toronto. So they're community designers. So they're like, we're coming here as community designers to bring design to the community. But of course, quickly they realized there's design everywhere. But not everybody has access to design education, right? It might be expensive. You might not have time for it. So they decided to create workshops and to invite people to create with them. And that's really amazing that they really became also this community center. And their building in Toronto is also a place where people from the community can exhibit their work. They're also involved in anti-gentrification collectives. So I think this is really amazing to see how these designers are really making a kind of a social relation really tangible, and not only looking at the kind of like individual, you know, success and trying to kind of enrich yourself, whether to cultural value or monetary value. Yeah, so that's it for me. I wanted to end also a little bit with this idea of degrowth that is often criticized for being a way of saying you all have to be poor. So Matthias Schmelzer writes also that degrowth is not a politics of less, but a politics of enough for all. That means that maybe many people in Europe will have to sacrifice some of their, some of their liberties, not flying anymore, not eating meat every day. But maybe other parts in the world still have to grow, right? But I think this degrowth is not necessarily a way of that is only like negative, but can really have been positive values on finding new ways of like living with one another. So that was it for me. So I hope you enjoyed it, and you can find me here.